The sound of boots on gravel broke the pre-dawn silence as guards marched past the barracks at Stalag Luft 3 on November 14, 1943. Inside, Lieutenant Montgomery Harrington pressed himself against the wall of his bunk, his heart hammering against his ribcage as he gripped the contraband radio component, a crude coil wrapped around a toilet paper tube. The metallic smell of the copper wire he'd painstakingly extracted from camp wiring mixed with the musty dampness of the barracks. Behind him, 3 fellow airmen formed a human shield, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light as they pretended to play cards. They all knew the penalty for possessing radio parts, solitary confinement or worse. The footsteps grew louder, then paused at their door. Montgomery swallowed hard, tucking the component into a hollow space he'd carved beneath his wooden bunk. A key rattled in the lock. As the door swung open, Montgomery picked up a tin cup, feigning nonchalance while carefully positioning himself to block the guard's view of his handiwork. The German officer swept his flashlight across the room, lingering for a moment on Montgomery's face. "Inspection?" he barked in heavily accented English. No one in Stalag Luft 3, neither prisoner nor guard, could have imagined that the collection of soup cans, pencils, and scavenged wiring hidden throughout the camp would soon become a secret network that would outsmart the Third Reich's information blockade and ultimately save dozens of lives. Montgomery Harrington was born in Oak Ridge, Idaho on March 7, 1916, the third son of a railroad engineer. His childhood home sat on the edge of town, where the rhythmic clicks and whistles of passing trains formed the soundtrack to his earliest memories. Even as a boy, Montgomery displayed an uncanny talent for mechanical tinkering. While other children played with toy soldiers or marbles, he would disassemble his father's pocket watch, memorizing the intricate dance of gears and springs before carefully reassembling the timepiece. By his 12th birthday, he had built a crystal radio receiver using scrap parts and instructions from a dog-eared science magazine. He would stay up late into the night, headphones pressed against his ears, picking up distant broadcasts from as far away as Chicago and Denver. His mother would often find him asleep at his desk, the homemade headset still clamped to his head. "That boy could make a telegraph out of twigs if you gave him enough time," his father would boast to neighbors. After graduating high school in 1934, Montgomery enrolled in electrical engineering at Idaho State College. His professors quickly recognized his exceptional aptitude for radio technology, which was evolving rapidly during those pre-war years. In his spare time, he worked at a local radio repair shop, handling everything from simple tube replacements to complex circuit redesigns. The shop owner, Mr. Zachariah Jenkins, became a mentor to the young man, teaching him not just the science of radio, but also the art of improvisation. "It's not what tools you have," Jenkins would say, tapping a finger against Montgomery's temple, "but how you use what's between your ears that matters." He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between Montgomery and complete isolation in one of the war's most notorious prisoner of war camps. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Montgomery was 25 years old and already working for Western Electric as a communications specialist. Like thousands of young American men, he felt the immediate call to duty. By February 1942, he had enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces, where his expertise in radio communications earned him a position as a radio operator and navigator on a B-17 Flying Fortress. After accelerated training, he was assigned to the 385th Bombardment Group, stationed in Great Ashfield, England. His crew members initially viewed the quiet, bookish radio operator with some skepticism. Lieutenant Jasper Wilcox, the plane's pilot, would later recall, "Harrington didn't look like much. Skinny fellow with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that never seemed to stay still. But the first time our radio malfunctioned over the channel and he fixed it using just a pocket knife and some chewing gum wrapper, we knew he was something special." By the summer of 1943, Montgomery had flown 17 combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. His squadron nicknamed their B-17 Sparky's Revenge in honor of Montgomery's radio call sign. On their 18th mission, a daylight bombing run over German ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, disaster struck. Their aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire, setting the right wing ablaze and sending them into a spiral. "Bail out! Bail out!" came the frantic order through the intercom. Montgomery helped the wounded tail gunner secure his parachute before attaching his own. As he leapt from the burning aircraft, he watched 3 other parachutes bloom against the blue October sky. They were the lucky ones. 4 of their crewmates went down with the plane. Montgomery landed hard in a farmer's field just outside Würzburg, Germany. His ankle twisted painfully as he tried to gather his parachute and find cover. Before he could reach the tree line, he was surrounded by armed members of the local Volkssturm, civilian militia. 3 days of interrogation followed, during which he provided nothing beyond his name, rank, and service number, as required by the Geneva Convention. He thought about his training, about the classified radio frequencies and codes he carried in his memory. The Germans were particularly interested in the American bombing patterns and radio protocols. Montgomery revealed nothing. He was eventually transported by cattle car, along with dozens of other captured Allied airmen, to Stalag Luft 3, a prisoner of war camp specifically designed for captured Air Force officers. As the train rattled through the German countryside, Montgomery stared out through the slats at the passing landscape, unaware that his greatest challenge and his greatest opportunity to make a difference still lay ahead. His mind was already turning over possibilities, cataloging resources, and formulating plans. He had no way of knowing that his next creation would not be built with the precision tools of Western Electric, but with soup cans, pencil lead, and the most powerful resource available to him, human ingenuity. Stalag Luft 3 was situated near the German town of Sagan, now Jagan in Poland, 90 miles southeast of Berlin. Opened in March 1942, it was designed specifically to hold captured Allied airmen, particularly officers. By the time Montgomery arrived in late 1943, the camp housed over 10,000 prisoners, predominantly American and British. The Germans believed that airmen, with their technical training and education, posed the highest escape risk and therefore required special security measures. The camp was divided into several compounds separated by barbed wire fences. Montgomery was assigned to the East Compound, which primarily housed American airmen. The barracks were Spartan wooden buildings with triple-tiered bunks. Each prisoner received a single blanket, a small cupboard for personal items, and little else. The International Red Cross provided occasional packages containing food supplements, cigarettes, and basic toiletries, items that would later prove invaluable for more than their intended purposes. German propaganda broadcast regularly boasted of the Third Reich's victories and the inevitable defeat of the Allies. Cut off from outside information, many prisoners began to doubt whether they would ever see home again. For Montgomery and his fellow POWs, accurate news from the outside world wasn't just a comfort, it was a lifeline of hope. The camp was specifically designed to isolate prisoners from war news. Camp Commander Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindiner-Wildau ran a strict operation, though he generally adhered to the Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners. Routine searches of barracks sought to eliminate any contraband, especially components that could be used for escape tools or communication devices. Despite these measures, a robust exchange economy flourished within the camp walls. Cigarettes from Red Cross packages became currency. Skills were bartered. A tailor might mend clothes in exchange for a chocolate ration, or an artist might draw a portrait of a fellow prisoner to send home in return for coffee. The camp contained a surprising number of talented individuals. Among Montgomery's barracks mates was Lieutenant Sebastian Fitzroy. A former physics professor from Princeton, Lieutenant Wallace Pemberton, who had designed radio systems for RCA before the war, and Flight Lieutenant Oscar Hargrove, a resourceful Canadian who had worked as a mechanic for the Royal Canadian Air Force. Each brought different skills that would later be crucial to their clandestine radio operations. The Germans maintained rigid control over information entering the camp. Newspapers were prohibited, mail was heavily censored, and the only radio broadcasts permitted were official German programming piped through loudspeakers in common areas. This information blackout was not just about security. It was psychological warfare. "They wanted to break our spirit," Flight Lieutenant Hargrove later wrote in his memoir. Without news of Allied advances, without knowledge of what was happening on the home front, they hoped we would surrender not just our bodies, but our minds. As autumn turned to winter in 1943, conditions in the camp deteriorated. Food rations were reduced as German supplies dwindled. The barracks, built with green lumber that warped and shrank as it dried, provided little protection against the bitter cold. Prisoners huddled together for warmth, telling stories of home and making plans for their return, plans that grew more elaborate and less realistic as the weeks passed. At night, when the lights were extinguished, Montgomery would lie awake, listening to the creak of the wooden bunks and the occasional muffled sob of homesickness. During these dark hours, an idea began to form in his mind. If he could create even a simple radio receiver, they could access BBC broadcasts and learn the truth about the war's progress. The risks were enormous. Discovery meant severe punishment, but the potential reward of accurate information seemed worth it. Montgomery began to take mental inventory of materials available to him: the foil from cigarette packages, the wire from a broken fence, the graphite from pencils, the tin from soup cans. Each item, mundane in normal circumstances, now represented a component in his mental schematic. As he drifted to sleep, visions of circuit diagrams replaced his dreams of home. He had no idea that his midnight musings would soon become the foundation of one of the most daring acts of technological resistance of the entire war. "What we need," Montgomery whispered during the morning roll call on December 12, 1943, "is a meeting. South Latrine, after lunch." The words passed from man to man along the formation line, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of the guards. By 1 o'clock, 5 men had gathered in the relative privacy of the latrine building, strategically positioning themselves to appear engaged in ordinary bathroom activities. "Should a guard enter? I think I can build a radio," Montgomery announced, his voice barely audible over the sound of running water. His 4 companions stared at him in disbelief. "With what?" Lieutenant Pemberton asked skeptically. "Have you seen any vacuum tubes lying around that I've missed?" Montgomery smiled thinly. "We don't need traditional components. I can make a crystal set. It won't be powerful, but if conditions are right, we might pick up the BBC." For the next hour, as prisoners came and went around them, Montgomery outlined his plan. They would need a diode, the heart of any crystal radio. Traditionally made from a germanium crystal and a thin wire cat's whisker, Montgomery proposed an alternative: pencil lead and a razor blade. The oxidized surface of a razor blade, when touched with graphite at just the right point, could create the semiconductor junction needed to detect radio signals. "Where do we get wire for the coil?" asked Lieutenant Fitzroy. "And how do we hide an antenna big enough to pick up anything?" These were legitimate concerns. A radio without an antenna and coil was useless. The wiring from the heating system in the theater building, Montgomery suggested. "It's copper, and they'll never notice if we take it bit by bit. As for the antenna—" He paused, considering. "We'll run it under the floorboards, through multiple barracks if necessary." The men exchanged glances, weighing the audacity of the plan against the harsh reality of their isolation. "And if we're caught?" Lieutenant Hargrove asked, voicing what they all were thinking. Montgomery didn't sugarcoat it. "Solitary confinement at best, execution at worst. This isn't a decision I make for anyone but myself." Silence fell over the group as each man considered the proposition. Finally, Lieutenant Pemberton spoke. "I spent 3 years designing radios for RCA. If you're doing this, Harrington, I'm in." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. "Well then," Montgomery said, extending his hand into the center of their circle, "let's get to work." The collection of materials began immediately, disguised within the normal routines of camp life. Red Cross packages became treasure troves. The cardboard tubes from toilet paper rolls would form the basis for coil forms. The tinfoil from cigarette packages could serve as capacitor plates. The metal from food cans would be shaped into terminals and connectors. Lieutenant Hargrove volunteered to create a distraction in the theater building during a propaganda film allowing Montgomery and Fitzroy to carefully extract 6 feet of copper wire from behind a wall panel. The wire was unraveled, respooled, and smuggled back to the barracks hidden in the lining of Fitzroy's coat. Lieutenant Pemberton, leveraging his pre-war connections, befriended a guard with a passion for American jazz. Through careful conversation, he learned that this guard, Unterscharführer Dieter Kruger, had once been a radio repairman in Munich before the war. Over the course of several weeks, Pemberton extracted valuable technical information about local broadcast frequencies and signal strengths, all under the guise of discussing music transmission. As January 1944 progressed, the components of their clandestine receiver took shape. Montgomery fashioned a variable capacitor using tinfoil sheets separated by paper soaked in paraffin wax from candles. The diode, the most critical and difficult component, required multiple attempts. The first razor blade they obtained wasn't oxidized enough to function properly. The second was too corroded. It wasn't until their third attempt, using a blade aged through a careful process of controlled exposure to the damp air near the shower facilities, that they created a usable detection surface. Finding the sensitive spot on this makeshift diode would be a matter of patience and precision, touching the pencil lead to different points on the blade until a signal was detected. For headphones, they modified a broken pair of eyeglasses, attaching wires to small tin diaphragms salvaged from soup cans. The sound would be faint, but in the quiet of night, it might be enough. The antenna presented the greatest challenge. A crystal set required a long antenna to collect sufficient signal energy. Using a network of collaborators across multiple barracks, they installed nearly 60 feet of wire, running it under floorboards, inside wall spaces, and along the undersides of bunks. Each segment was installed during carefully timed periods when guards were changing shifts or during mandated activities that drew supervision elsewhere. The risk increased with every inch of wire they laid. A single discovery would compromise not just their radio project, but potentially implicate dozens of men across the East Compound. "I lay awake at night thinking about what we were risking," Lieutenant Fitzroy later recalled. "Not just our own safety, but that of every man who helped us, every man who knew and kept silent. The burden of that responsibility was almost unbearable." Yet they persisted, driven by the collective hunger for unfiltered news and the psychological victory that such access would represent. By early February 1944, the components were ready for assembly. The final construction had to be done in absolute secrecy. They chose the night of February 7th, when the Germans were celebrating a reported victory on the Eastern Front with extra rations of schnapps for the guards. Pemberton and Hargrove stationed themselves as lookouts at strategic points, while Montgomery and Fitzroy huddled in the narrow space beneath Montgomery's bunk, working by the dim light of a carefully shielded candle. With trembling hands, part excitement, part fear, Montgomery connected the final wires to their makeshift tuning capacitor. "If this works," he whispered to Fitzroy, "we'll be the first in this camp to hear the truth in months." Fitzroy nodded grimly. "And if it doesn't work, We've risked everything for nothing." Montgomery paused, wire cutters hovering over the final connection. "Not for nothing," he replied. "For trying. Sometimes that's all we can do." He made the cut, stripped the insulation, and twisted the copper strands together. The circuit was complete. They decided to wait until after lights out for the first test. The fewer men awake and moving about, the less chance of discovery. At 11:15 that night, Montgomery carefully extracted the radio from its hiding place and connected the antenna wire and the ground wire, which ran to a metal bed frame sunk partially into the earth floor. He placed the makeshift headphones to his ears and began the painstaking process of finding the sensitive spot on their diode, touching the pencil lead to the razor blade and adjusting the tuning capacitor simultaneously. For 20 agonizing minutes, he heard nothing but static and his own pulse pounding in his ears. Beside him, the 3 other men waited in silence, their faces tense shadows in the near darkness. And then a voice, faint at first, then clearer as Montgomery refined the contact point on the diode. The unmistakable tones of a BBC announcer reading the news in measured, precise English. "Nerys. Allied forces have made significant advances in Italy, capturing in da-da-da." The voice faded, then strengthened again. Montgomery looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. Wordlessly, he passed the headphones to Fitzroy, whose expression shifted from skepticism to wonder as he listened. One by one, each man took his turn at the headphones, their faces transforming in the dim light. They had done it. Their collection of scavenged junk, soup cans, pencil leads, cardboard tubes, and stolen wire, had pierced the information blockade imposed by their captors. The news was good. The Allies were advancing on multiple fronts. The war was far from over, but the tide was turning. As they carefully disassembled the radio and returned it to its hiding place, a new energy coursed through them. They had created a lifeline to the truth, and with it, rekindled the flame of hope that the Germans had tried so hard to extinguish. The impact of Montgomery's creation extended far beyond the initial thrill of technical success. Within days, a system was established to disseminate the information gathered from nightly BBC broadcasts. The men established a code to discuss news in public areas, referring to Allied advances as baseball scores and Axis losses as rainy weather in Berlin. The knowledge that German propaganda broadcasts were lies provided psychological armor against the enemy's attempts to break their spirits. More practically, the accurate war information helped the camp's escape committee make strategic decisions. Knowing which regions were under Allied control could mean the difference between freedom and capture, or life and death, for escapees. By late February 1944, Montgomery had refined his design, creating a more sensitive detector that improved reception. Lieutenant Pemberton contributed a crucial innovation, a switch mechanism that allowed the antenna to be completely disconnected from the radio when not in use, reducing the risk of detection during surprise inspections. The radio components themselves were distributed among multiple hiding places. The diode was concealed inside a hollowed-out chess piece. The tuning capacitor was hidden inside a false-bottomed Red Cross package. The antenna wire remained in place, but was disguised as ordinary clothesline in sections where it couldn't be completely concealed. Despite their precautions, there were many close calls. On March 3rd, German guards conducted a thorough inspection of the east compound, tearing up floorboards and emptying footlockers. Montgomery watched, his face a mask of practiced indifference, as a guard's boot came within inches of the loose board concealing one section of their antenna wire. That evening, after the search had concluded without discoveries, the group decided to implement additional security measures. They created a duplicate set of radio components to be hidden in the north compound, operated by a separate team. If one radio was discovered, the other could continue providing information. They also established a rigorous schedule of radio operation, limiting listening sessions to 20 minutes, and never on consecutive nights in the same location. We became more paranoid and more professional with each passing week, Lieutenant Hargrove noted in his post-war account. Every successful broadcast felt like we were stealing something precious right from under the Germans' noses. Rory Moore. As spring arrived in 1944, the BBC broadcasts brought increasingly positive news. The Allied bombing campaign against German industrial centers was intensifying. Soviet forces were pushing westward through occupied territories. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan. Each bit of good news spread through the camp like a tonic, straightening backs and lifting chins. Men who had sunk into depression began to engage again, participating in camp activities and making plans for their eventual return home. Montgomery's radio had become more than a technical achievement. It was a beacon of hope in the darkness of captivity. German officials noted the change in morale with suspicion. Increased inspections and surveillance followed. The camp's security officer, Hauptmann Heinrich Vogel, became particularly focused on uncovering the source of what he correctly suspected was unauthorized access to outside information. The prisoners know things they should not know, he reportedly told the camp commandant. Someone is either bringing news in or receiving it illegally. His scrutiny made the radio operation increasingly dangerous, requiring new levels of caution and deception. In early June 1944, the news they had all been waiting for finally came through the makeshift headphones. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. D-Day had arrived. The liberation of Europe had begun in earnest. The news electrified the camp, though they had to contain their excitement to avoid arousing German suspicion. Privately, men shook hands and embraced, their eyes bright with renewed hope. "We're going home, gentlemen," Lieutenant Pemberton whispered during a covert gathering in Barrack 6. "Maybe not tomorrow, but soon." What they couldn't know was that their greatest test was still to come. As Allied forces pushed eastward through France and eventually into Germany itself, the Nazi High Command grew increasingly desperate. Orders came down to evacuate prisoners from camps that might be liberated by advancing Allied armies. On January 27, 1945, with Soviet forces approaching from the east, the order was given to evacuate Stalag Luft 3. Over 11,000 prisoners were forced to march westward in one of the harshest winters on record, a journey that would come to be known as the March. With only a few hours' notice before the evacuation, Montgomery and his team faced a critical decision. Should they destroy the radio to prevent it from being discovered, or attempt to bring it on the march? The components were small and could be distributed among several men, but the antenna was another matter. Montgomery made the call. "Dismantle everything. Each man takes one component. We'll rebuild when we can." The evacuation was chaotic. Prisoners were allowed to take only what they could carry. Many were already weakened by years of captivity and inadequate nutrition. As they assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, Montgomery passed the radio components to his trusted circle. "Whatever happens," he told them, "this stays with us. This is how we'll know when it's over, when we're really going home." The march was brutal. Temperatures fell to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Men walked through snow drifts in threadbare clothing and inadequate footwear. Those who couldn't keep up were sometimes shot by the guards. Food was scarce, shelter inadequate, yet throughout this ordeal, the radio components remained safely hidden among personal effects and even within clothing seams. After marching for 53 miles, the prisoners from Stalag Luft 3 were loaded onto train cars for transport to other camps, deeper in German territory. Montgomery and many of his barracks mates ended up at Stalag 7A near Moosburg in Bavaria. There, amid the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of a camp well beyond its capacity, they faced their greatest challenge and their greatest opportunity. Rumors flew among the prisoners. The war was almost over. Hitler was dead. The Americans were coming. The Germans would execute all prisoners before surrender. Without reliable information, fear and false hope battled for supremacy. Montgomery gathered his team. "We need the radio now more than ever," he told them. Rebuilding proved even more difficult than the original construction. The new camp had fewer resources and more frequent inspections. But necessity drove innovation. Lieutenant Fitzroy discovered that the metal springs in the camp's ancient mattresses could be fashioned into a surprisingly effective antenna when properly arranged. Lieutenant Pemberton traded his prized wristwatch to a corrupt guard for actual radio wire, only 6 feet, but genuine copper with proper insulation. For a ground connection, they used a water pipe that ran beneath their barracks. On April 15, 1945, after 3 weeks of careful work, their reconstructed radio crackled to life in the cramped space beneath the barracks floor. The news confirmed their highest hopes. American forces were less than 50 miles from Moosburg. German defenses were crumbling on all fronts. The European war was in its final days. This intelligence became crucial when, on April 28th, camp guards began to exhibit increasingly erratic behavior. Some abandoned their posts. Others became more brutal. Reports circulated that SS units in the area had orders to execute prisoners rather than allow their liberation. Using information gleaned from BBC broadcasts about the precise location of American forces, Montgomery and the camp's senior officers made critical decisions about when to shelter in place versus when to actively resist German orders. They knew exactly how close freedom was, close enough to risk everything, but not so close as to risk it foolishly. On April the 29th, 1945, the sound of distant artillery grew steadily closer. Through their radio, they learned that elements of General Patton's Third Army were approaching Moosburg from the northwest. Camp leaders used this information to organize prisoners into units ready to secure vital areas if the German guards fled. The radio now operated almost continuously, manned in shifts by Montgomery's expanded team, providing real-time updates as liberation approached. Shortly after dawn on April 29th, tanks from the 14th Armored Division broke through the camp's perimeter. American flags, secretly made and hidden throughout the long years of captivity, unfurled from barracks windows. As the first American soldiers entered the camp, they were astonished to be greeted by prisoners who already knew their unit designations and recent movements. "How the hell do you know who we are?" one puzzled sergeant asked. Lieutenant Pemberton smiled and patted the pocket containing his piece of the miraculous radio. "Let's just say we've been keeping up with the news." In the immediate aftermath of liberation, as former prisoners awaited processing and transport home, Montgomery's radio became something of a legend among both freed POWs and their liberators. Several Army Signal Corps officers requested demonstrations of the ingenious device. One captain from the 368th Signal Corps Battalion was so impressed that he included detailed diagrams of Montgomery's design in his official report, noting, "The technical ingenuity displayed by these men under the most adverse conditions demonstrates a level of resourcefulness that should be studied and incorporated into survival training for all communications personnel." As Allied military authorities established proper communication channels within the liberated camps, the need for the secret radio diminished. Yet Montgomery and his team continued to operate it until their repatriation, a final act of defiance against the imprisonment that had failed to break their spirit or ingenuity. After returning to the United States in June 1945, Montgomery Harrington found the transition to civilian life challenging, as did many veterans. The focused intensity of war and captivity had forever altered his perspective. He took a position with RCA in Camden, New Jersey, where his wartime innovations earned him respect among colleagues who had spent the war years working with cutting-edge equipment and abundant resources. They had laboratories full of oscilloscopes and signal generators, he later recalled. I had soup cans and pencil lead. It changes how you approach problems. Montgomery rarely spoke about his wartime experiences in those early post-war years. Like many former POWs, he preferred to look forward rather than back. He married Dorothy Simmons, a former WASP, Women Air Force Service pilot, in 1946. They settled in Moorestown, New Jersey, and raised 3 children. His basement workshop became legendary in the neighborhood, a place where broken appliances were miraculously restored and where local ham radio enthusiasts gathered to exchange technical tips and war stories. It wasn't until a POW reunion in 1967 that the full story of the Stalag Luft 3 radio network began to emerge publicly. A journalist covering the event overheard Montgomery explaining his crystal set design to a former campmate and recognized the historical significance of the story. The resulting feature in Popular Electronics magazine brought national attention to Montgomery and his team. Letters poured in from former POWs who had benefited from the clandestine news service without ever knowing its source. "Your radio saved my sanity," wrote one former captain from Illinois. "Knowing the truth about the war's progress gave me strength to endure." Perhaps most meaningful was correspondence from the families of men who hadn't survived the war, but who had mentioned the secret radio in their final letters home. "My brother wrote about a miracle machine made of junk that brought them real news." One woman from Pennsylvania wrote, "He died during the evacuation march, but I want you to know that your work brought him hope in his final months." The recognition led to speaking engagements at technical schools and military academies, where Montgomery shared not just the technical details of his creation, but the larger lessons about human resourcefulness under extreme conditions. The Air Force Academy eventually incorporated the Stalag Luft 3 radio case study into its curriculum on survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training. The original radio components, carefully preserved by team members after liberation, were donated to the Smithsonian Institution in 1972, where they remain on display at the National Air and Space Museum. A small placard notes that the innocuous collection of salvaged items sustained hope and saved lives through the power of information. Montgomery continued consulting on communications systems well into his 70s, bringing his unique perspective to modern engineering challenges. When asked about the secret to innovation, he would often point to his wartime experience. "Constraints breed creativity," he would say. "When you have everything you need, you solve the problem directly. When you have nothing you need, you're forced to reimagine the problem itself." Perhaps the most profound legacy of Montgomery's work came through the lives touched by his innovation. Lieutenant Wallace Pemberton went on to develop emergency communication systems for disaster zones, directly influenced by his POW experience. Professor Sebastian Fitzroy returned to Princeton, where he established a research program focused on improvised electronic devices for use in resource-poor environments. Their wartime collaboration spawned a network of innovation that extended far beyond their own careers. In 1991, nearly 5 decades after their captivity, Montgomery received a letter from Germany that moved him to tears. It was from Dieter Kruger, the former guard whose unwitting technical advice had helped refine their radio design. Now an elderly man, Kruger had read about the radio in a translated article and recognized his own inadvertent role in its creation. "I am glad now that I helped, even without knowing," he wrote. "You showed more courage with your soup cans than many soldiers with their weapons." Montgomery's response was characteristic of his humble nature. "We were all just doing what we could with what we had. Sometimes that's enough." In the end, the story of Montgomery Harrington and his team transcends the technical achievement of building a radio from scavenged parts. It speaks to the indomitable human spirit that refuses to surrender to circumstances, that finds ways to maintain dignity and hope, even in the darkest times. Their improvised radio, born of desperation and ingenuity, became a symbol of resistance that extended beyond the barbed wire of Stalag Luft III. It represented the unbreakable connection between prisoners and the world they had been forced to leave behind. A tenuous but vital link to truth in an environment built on lies and intimidation. The soup can radios of World War II prisoner camps weren't just technological improvisations, they were acts of defiance that saved both lives and spirits. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter of World War II history, we might ask ourselves, what would we have done in Montgomery Harrington's position? Would we have risked severe punishment to create a lifeline of information for ourselves and our fellow prisoners? Would we have found the courage to transform soup cans and pencil lead into a weapon against despair? These questions touch on something fundamental about human nature, our need for connection, for truth, and for purpose, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Perhaps the greatest testament to Montgomery's achievement is not the radio itself, but what it represents, the refusal to be defined by captivity, the determination to remain engaged with the world beyond the camp walls, the insistence on hope when all external evidence suggested hopelessness. The next time you open a soup can or sharpen a pencil, take a moment to consider how these ordinary objects once became extraordinary tools in the hands of prisoners who refused to surrender their humanity. Their story reminds us that innovation isn't always about the latest technology or the biggest research budget. Sometimes it's about seeing possibilities where others see only limitations. Share this story so others remember what courage and ingenuity really mean, even when they come disguised as soup cans and scraps of wire, transformed by the powerful alchemy of human determination.